Some alphabet soup for the soul, a deep dive into the Hebrew alphabet, starting at the beginning. The ALEPH. The ALEPH is a distinctive and perhaps unusual shape. Might make some visual associations with it. What does your imagination do with this shape, the letter ALEPH? It's a mysterious letter, the ALEPH, for many reasons. We're going to go through and talk about 5 different dimensions of each of the letters of the alphabet. And for a system which was pretty ingenious, right? Maybe as ingenious as the creation of the internet itself, a technology of components of symbols that represented sounds that transformed oral language into a written form. It's quite amazing, but oral language is about sounds and creating symbols for sounds. That's what consonants are, letters, which makes this first letter very intriguing because it is a sign, a symbol, without a sound. It represents silence itself, stillness, or perhaps the time or space prior to language, consciousness prior to language itself. ALEPH. So when it's written, you have to put a vowel with it for it to have a sound, but in and of itself, it has no sound. Each letter of the alphabet has a name too in the Hebrew alphabet. The word ALEPH has several meanings or several associations. In its most ancient form, the early Proto-Sinaitic script, it is shaped like the head of an ox, and may have come to represent a head of oxen, which is a very interesting idea, right? Is when you say a head of oxen, is the word head singular or plural? And of course, it's both. It is a singular word, right? It has a singular verb conjunctions, and yet it represents many. So the letter, prior to there being a numeric system, the Hebrew letters were used also to represent numbers. So this is not only how a letter you use to represent the sound of silence, but it is also the symbol used to write the number 1. And yet, the word ALEPH is related to the word ALEPH, which means it's the Hebrew word for 1,000. So it means both 1 and 1,000. It means both oneness and unity, as well as plurality, diversity, many. So if I were to try to translate ALEPH into a single phrase, it might be diversity unified, or many in one, like the singular ox head or head of oxen is a singular phrase that represents a plurality. And this is really perhaps why this letter came to represent God. God as many in one, right? Or as the unity that underlies all of existence. Other associations with that word or that shoresh, that Hebrew root, ALEPH, Alephim, are chieftains or heads of a community or of a troop. And also the word ulpan, which you may be familiar with as a Hebrew language program, is how they taught the thousands, millions of immigrants that came to Israel, coming through and learning Hebrew through an ulpan, uses the same consonants as ALEPH and ALEPH, which is a learning center or a learning program. So learning itself is represented, all in the name ALEPH, ox head or head of oxen, oneness. Infinity, or like a number 1,000, was like almost beyond counting. A chieftain or a leader, and learning. It also seems to me that if you drew a circle around this letter, that it would look like the Chinese symbol, the Far Eastern symbol of the yin-yang. So I drew a circle. Let's see if you can see that a little bit. With the dots here and here representing sort of if you took away the stem, the two dots, and then, of course, the curved line separating them. So if wouldn't take much to transform the letter Aleph or transpose it onto a yin-yang circle with one black and one white side, with a white dot and a black dot in each of the two sides. And of course, the symbol of yin-yang represents balance, a coming together of opposites, or masculine and feminine forces, light and shadow contained within one another. This may also be part of the power of the symbol of Aleph, as representing this holding of opposites, this containment of duality, or the duality of singularity and plurality contained in one. According to an ancient mystical text, so it's sort of dated by historians around the 7th century CE, but the text itself is attributed to Abraham, going all the way back 4,000 years or so or more to our ancestor, our father Abraham in the Bible. This text, Sefer Yetzirah, it's called, describes the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in sort of 3 tiers, sort of expanding concentric circles, if you will. At a future class, I'll show you an image of that. And the first 3 letters are like the primary elements or the primary colors. So of air, ether, water, and fire, yellow, blue, and red. And Aleph is representing the air or the ether, the space in which everything else is contained. And that makes a place for all the rest of existence. So we also have in Kabbalah, in that same text, the image first described, textually anyway, as a tree of life, or the system of 10 sphirot, 10 energy centers. They're similar to chakras, maybe in a more detailed form. And the 10 energy centers are connected by 22 pathways. Now that's not an accident, right? So each letter corresponds to one of the 22 pathways or conduits or channels that connect the energy centers, which exist in all of creation, or it may be better thought of as the process through which quantum reality becomes physical reality, or a thought becomes an action, or a potential becomes something actualized. So how do things in thought or in metaphysical conceptual form take physical form? They go through these 10 channels or 10 sphere energy centers, and they move from one energy center or sphera to another through 22 channels. So the first one, at the very center of the whole diagram, on a horizontal axis, is the Aleph. It represents this center chamber between Chesed and Gevura, which is where we stand right now in the Sfirot, actually, and the counting of the Omer. So the Aleph is the sort of centerpiece or the beginning point of the tree of life and of humanity, because each of those 22 letters, our tradition suggests, corresponds to one of the 22 matriarchs from the Hebrew Bible, from our ancient Israelite tradition. And of course, the person who corresponds whose name or persona corresponds to the Aleph might be best named as the character Eve from the Garden of Eden. Now, her name was Chava in Hebrew, but that name is explained with the phrase Aim Kol Chai. She is the mother of all life, the mother of all living. So to think of the Aleph as like the womb, the container within which through which all of existence comes to pass. Aleph is the beginning of all of that. So the silence, primordial space, the ether in which all things come to be. So amazing. Already we've just gotten through the sign, the shape of the letter, the sound, which is silent, and now we're beginning to talk about the letter as a symbol, and the name of the letter as a symbol. So these symbols trigger stories from our tradition. So the Aleph represents a new beginning, and one of the new beginnings that is described in Midrashic tradition is the beginning of a new religion or spiritual path that marks an end to idolatry. So the narrative in our tradition is that Abraham took up a staff, and his father was an idol maker, and he used the staff and he smashed all the idols in the store except the biggest one. And then he put the staff, sort of leaned it up against the hand or the arm of the largest statue, the largest icon. And then when the father came home and said, hey, what happened? What'd you do, Abraham or Avram? Abraham said, well, it wasn't me, obviously, it was the idol. And his father said, but wait a minute, the idols can't do anything, they can't move. And Abraham says, so then why do you sell them as if they're gods? So this is presented as the beginning of a new way of thinking about God, as this intangible force that underlies all of creation, right? A silence that underlies sound, that precedes sound, and yet connects all sounds together. So the Aleph is a symbol of a new path, or a stimulant, an initiate, and it represents, it is the lead-off of a new system for recording and counting the reality that we experience. And of course we now call that written language. The revelations of the Ten Commandments begin with the letter Aleph, the word Anochi. So that's the beginning of a new period in history where sort of the rule of law comes to replace the law of a ruler, right? So the end of dictatorship and monarchy and the beginnings of democracy are highlighted in the Ten Commandments, the sort of proto-constitution. And in each of those stories, the story of Abraham, whose name also starts with an Aleph, the word Av, father, starts with an Aleph, as well as Aim, or mother, starting with an Aleph. So too the beginning, the first word of the Ten Commandments starts with an Aleph. That sort of silence. Out of silence begins our capacity to translate the silence into a way of life, and that's really what we're up to. I want to move from those two stories to thinking about what are some of the other forces underlying this powerful symbol, potent symbol that is linking our extension of love and boundless love, and our willingness to recognize our limitations, right? Infinite potential, quantum reality, coming to be contained in a limited space. So for me, the letter Aleph, and I think in the mystical tradition, represents we talked about the oneness behind the thousand faces of reality, or in the language of the mysticism, the Or de Kadmon, the primordial light. In the story of creation, in the first chapter of Genesis, in day one, God said, "Let there be light." Yehi or, vayihi or. Let there be light, and there was light. And yet, it's not until day 4 when the sun and the moon and the stars are said to be created. So the rabbis ask, what is this, the light that was created on the first day? If it wasn't the light of the sun and the moon and the stars, sort of the light we're familiar with on Earth. So they named that light Or de Kadmon, the primordial light. The word Or can be translated, of course, as light, but it also can be translated as energy, as primordial energy that preceded, sort of the Big Bang, or there was a containment of energy there. And in sort of cosmological science, we are taught that the origin of the cosmos began in this singularity, a single point that contained all that would exist, right? It sort of exploded, Big Bang, and emerged into this plurality and diversity of life that we are blessed with, right? That all this beauty that we experience emerges. And so the Aleph represents that still point at the origin of existence, or the singularity that precedes distinctions of light and dark, of energy and matter, and become a reminder, especially a reminder woven into the components of language itself, that language is limited. Language is already a limitation of reality. And language precedes thought, so too, the thoughts that we think have a rakia, a limit. And beyond that is the infinite, which is represented by Aleph. So any word, or any time the Aleph appears in a word, it's a reminder of the reality that points beyond itself, right? This symbol that points it beyond itself to an infinite reality. All right, we've got a few minutes left. I'm going for a 22-minute. So I want to do a teaching about the gematria. Gematria comes connected to the word geometry. It's a recognition that each of the letters have a numerical equivalent. And if you take the Hebrew letter Aleph, you can break it down into 2 smaller letters. And so there's the letter Vav that goes on a diagonal, and then these 2 adjacent drawings or markings could be the same letter, or the letter Yud. So these letters, if you add them up, the smaller components of the letter Aleph are Yud, which are both represent 10, and the letter Vav, which represents 6. So added together, they represent the number 26, which also happens to be the numerical value of the unspoken name for God that we use in the Shema and other prayers. We pronounce that word Adonai. It's spelled with the Hebrew letters Yud, He, Vav, He, 10, 5, 6, and 5, also adding up to 26. So when we say something like the Shema, which means, "Hear, O Israel, remember that Adonai is our God, and Adonai is one." So the numerical value for Adonai, Yud He Vav He, is 26, and the numerical value for the letter that represents the number 1, the Aleph, is also 26. So it's also a numerical equation that we're stating. when we declare something like the unity of God. The Shema is probably the most prominent and well-known declaration of faith in Jewish tradition. And the Hebrew word for faith is emunah. Emunah. It's where we get the word amen, which also begins with an aleph. I affirm, right? I affirm that, or second that statement, that prayer. The first letter of the word for faith in Hebrew is one that is beyond knowing, beyond our understanding, right? We can't conceptualize all in one, or unity in diversity. We might be able to glimpse it now and then, or maybe even feel it in our experience or in our souls, but the mind can't capture that. Language cannot capture that. So neither can creed or articulated faith. So here's ways in which the aleph appears in our tradition. So I mentioned before about the sfirot and the role that the aleph plays right at the beginning. The other word that begins with the letter aleph that I'll share with you now is the word ayin, which means nothingness. This is teaching that creation was formed yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. So here the aleph represents that nothingness or no thingness that precedes things, devarim, words, language, existence. It is the ultimate seed syllable, the letter aleph.